Good morning, it's Jeremy. It's Friday, April 23rd, and I want to talk about the remote headless operation of OpenPlotter with a Raspberry Pi 4. Now, up to now, I've been doing my work with OpenPlotter using a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, and it's embedded in a Pi Top 3 development laptop. So basically, it's got a keyboard and a screen, so you can access the Raspberry Pi right away, and it also has a proto board which you can access a GPIO. So that's been what I've been doing my work on up to now. So what I wanted to do was get a Raspberry Pi 4 just to see the difference between the 4 and the 3B. It's got a lot more horsepower, but it takes a lot more current, of course. So what I did is I went on Amazon and I bought a starter kit. So here's the Raspberry Pi 4. It comes with a case and a fan. I think it's 4 gigs of RAM. And there's 3 heat sinks which you put on. So basically that was the kit that I used. I assembled it. Now it comes with an SD card, a 32 gig SD card, and the SD card was formatted with Noobs and Raspbian, but I wanted to put on the the OpenPlotter Basic Headless image, so I had to clean up the SD card. Now previously I had a dual boot desktop with Ubuntu, and I was able to use Fdisk. But now I'm using Ubuntu on a virtual machine, so I don't have access to the Fdisk. So what I did was I took my SD card, put it in Windows 10 on the disk management utility, I think it's called, or computer management utility, found out what disk number it was, and then I used the disk part DOS utility to clean up the SD card. And then I used Raspberry Pi Imager to put the OpenPlotter image on the disk. Now, to actually turn up the Raspberry Pi 4, I've got a Toshiba TB here, which is an HDMI connector. And over here, I've got a couple of older Raspberry Pis. I've got a USB keyboard and a mouse. And that's where I installed the OpenPlotter operating system. And then after that, I was able to connect to my I've got a router down there, an ISP router. So I was able to use the router and the internet connection to complete the installation of the Raspberry Pi 4. And then for the wireless, I had to disconnect it from the router because the Wi-Fi hotspot on the router would conflict. Let's go over to my desktop and we'll just go through the blog post, which has got all the details. So I'm just looking at my blog post now, which has got all the details of the Wi-Fi hotspot installation. This is how I plan to use it in the field, and that'll be my next post. There's the Raspberry Pi 4 in the case, and I'm going to have an RTL SDR for the AIS receiver, and that's going to be the antenna, just the vertical whip. I'm going to operate off a lithium battery, which is, I'm going to float charge it with a solar panel. There's my GPS receiver. And there's a GY91 sensor board, which has the heel and the pitch and the compass bearing, the temperature and the pressure. And then I'm going to remotely access the Raspberry Pi 4 with the iPhone. So that's the objective. So I'm going to take it down to Harbourfront on my next post and test it out. So this is how I've been working up to now. So I've been using the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus in the Pi Top, which has got everything. It's got a screen and a keyboard and everything else. And when I needed to connect to the internet, I just connected to my router, and I used the IP address that the router assigns to the Pi Top. So that was a standalone configuration. And then what I did was with the Raspberry Pi 4, once I had it booted up over at the TV and the keyboard and the mouse, I was able to sit on my couch and connect over internet using the VNC server and VNC VIewer to get everything configured here. And then, but I had to go back to the TV when I set up the Wi-Fi hotspot, because this thing would have, the Wi-Fi hotspot would have conflicted with the ISP router. So I disconnected that. And this is how I'm going to use it in the field. The Wi-Fi hotspot has an IP address of 10.10.10.1 for VNC server. And then on the iPhone, I downloaded the application VNC Connect, which contains server and viewer. And I just use the viewer. I go into the address book and I set up the IP 10.10.10.1. And the name of the computer is Pi. and the Wi-Fi connection is called OpenPlotter. So here I just talk about the installation and using the disk part utility to clean up the SD card, because if you buy one of the starter kits, it probably has noobs and Raspbian on it. So you may not necessarily want to use that. You want to put the OpenPlotter on there. So you have to clean up the SD cards. That's the first part of that. When you boot up, well, let's go into, there's OpenMarine and the OpenPlotter download page. So up to now, I've been using Raspberry Pi 3 with a basic installation and OpenPlotter starting. That's what I've been using up to now. So what I wanted to do with the Raspberry Pi 4 is try this one, OpenPlotter Headless. So that's the image I downloaded to use. So back to Blogpost here. So when you boot up, everything checks out. You get an error message saying, please change the default Wi-Fi access password. So that's just to remind you when you set up the hotspot, change the password, otherwise anybody can get in. So when you boot up, you'll see that these three items are not installed. They're there, but they need to be installed, and that's the Signal K installer, the network, and the CAN bus. So I install those. And then once that's all installed, reboot the Raspberry Pi 4, and then open the network menu option under OpenPlotter, and this is what you get. So I didn't change anything here. There's another option in here which I didn't use. I just want to simply have a Wi-Fi hotspot. I don't want to connect to a Marina Wi-Fi or anything else. I just want the Raspberry Pi to be the hotspot, and that's it, with no other connections. So I didn't check this, I didn't check that. I just used the default here. Now you have to go down here and click this, otherwise this will all be grayed out. So you click this and this suddenly comes alive. So I left this at auto. I call the network OpenPlotter, and then I put in a password that's easy to type in. I'm older, my fingers are big, so on the iPhone I'm not great at using that keypad, so I wanted something simple that I could put in on the iPhone. So I put in something simple there. And then I removed the Pi 4 from the network connection, and I went back to my TV, and then I clicked here. You get an error, you get a warning saying, be careful if you're connected to a router, because you might screw everything up. So which is good. I went to the manual and checked that. So then I clicked here, and so everything's done. I rebooted, and then I went into my iPhone. I enabled the Wi-Fi. I found the OpenPlotter hotspot, and then I downloaded VNC Connect, which contains a server and the viewer. It's a little bit confusing. I went through all these menus here, and I thought, why do I have to sign in? That's really when you want to use the server or the cloud service. But what I did finally is I hit the address book, and I put in the name of the computer and the IP address of 10.10.10.1, and lo and behold, I was able to connect. So it connects very nicely, and it gives you a little quick tutorial on how to use the mouse with finger movements on the iPhone. And there it is, and it worked. So in my next post, what I want to do is I want to go out into the field with this and see how well it works on battery power with a solar panel.